Good afternoon and welcome to today's program titled Transcending the Double Closet of Wealth and Substance Abuse. I'm Gary Enos, editor of Addiction Professional magazine. Today's program is sponsored by Caron Treatment Centers. Thank you to our sponsor and to you and our audience for giving us your time and attention. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping details. Each window on your screen can be moved by clicking and dragging, or enlarged and minimized by clicking the icons in the top right corner of each window. Please use the Q&A area to the right of the slides to submit a question at any time. If you cannot see this area, simply click the red Q&A button. To download a copy of today's slides, please click the link in the Resources area in the bottom left of your screen. If you have any technical issues during today's program, please click the yellow Help button to troubleshoot the issue. For those seeking CE credit, certificates will be distributed via the green CE certificate button at the end of today's program, so please wait for further instructions at the conclusion of today's event. You can also tweet during today's presentation via the Twitter widget by clicking on the blue Twitter icon at the bottom of your screen. Simply click the Post and Authorize buttons to log into your Twitter account and begin sharing at the hashtag #APDoubleCloset. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Paul Hokemeyer, JD, PhD. Paul Hokemeyer is a nationally recognized expert on family dynamics and addictions and one of the nation's leading experts on wealth and substance abuse disorders. He holds a BA in economics, an MA in family systems, a PhD in psychology, and a doctorate in law. His dissertation research, in which he developed the construct of internalized wealthism, was recently published by Lambert Academic Press. Currently, Dr. Hokemeyer maintains a private practice in Midtown Manhattan and is senior clinical advisor to Caron Ocean Drive in Boca Raton, Florida. In addition, he is a highly sought-after expert quoted regularly in various print media such as the Wall Street Journal, Time, the Johns Hopkins Newsletter, CNN.com, Private Wealth, The Washington Post, WebMD, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Examiner. Thank you, Paul, for taking the time to speak with us today, and with that, the audience is yours.
Thank you, Gary, and I'd like to thank Addiction Professionals for giving me this opportunity and to the Caron Treatment Centers for allowing me to pursue this work that I'm going to be talking to you about today. So let's jump right in and go over the objectives that we're going to accomplish today. What we're going to do is really begin to identify and utilize the transferential and countertransferential issues that impact the psychotherapeutic relationship in working with patients of wealth. We're going to talk about the constructs of wealthism and internalized wealthism, and we're going to recognize and begin to utilize the construct of the double closet and how it impacts the treatment of people of wealth, power, and status. And you'll notice throughout this presentation that I basically combine these three identities, wealth, power, and status, and I talk in terms of an elite identity construct. So when you hear me talking about an elite identity construct, that's basically what I'm referring to. So as an overview of where we're going to go, I want to just put forth a number of 3 bullet points basically. Some of these are well established and we can all agree on them, and other ones are going to challenge us a little bit. So the first one is that the shame and stigma surrounding substance abuse disorders keeps people who suffer from them isolated and alone. I think all of us who work in the field and have worked in the field for a while know that the disease of addiction is very isolating and secretive. And this phenomenon is compounded when the person with the disorder has an elite identity, and we'll talk about the reasons why. In this workshop, we'll explore the unique ways wealth and power play out in the treatment setting and the construct of the double closet. So essentially what we're going to do, to break it down, is that we're going to do something that's not done in polite company, and that is that we are going to talk about money. And really we know that in today's world, really one of the last remaining taboos is money and our resistance to talk about money. I found out through my own research that people are much more comfortable talking about their sexuality than their wealth. My initial research project involved a study of male homosexuals who had a net worth of $10 million and above, because I really wanted to look at how one very clearly established stigmatized identity would manifest itself with an identity that I hypothesized had some stigmatized features to it, but really hadn't been looked at in a lot of details. And in looking and talking to this population again, I found that the participants were very willing to tell me who they slept with, how they slept with them, and how many times they slept with them. But when it came time to talk about their net worth, several of them just said, well, Dr. Hokemeyer, you have a minimum qualification for this study of $10 million, and suffice it to say that I meet that requirement. So they were very resistant to talking about their money, and many of them talked about that in the in-depth interviews that I did with them. It's also important to note that we therapists are not immune from this reluctance to talk about money. We shy away from directly talking about money with our patients and clients, and so I think we all need to look back at our own treatment and see, when it comes time to talking to a patient about collecting a bill, raising fees, there's a certain amount of resistance that we run into. Part of the reason why this is that money is really a very highly charged energetic. And if we look at this young girl on our screen, we see that, that there's this huge charge that money brings to us. Specifically, researchers have broken this down and said that the charge of money really expresses itself in a number of ways. The first one is through mistrust and suspicion. Another way that money can manifest itself is by fostering alliances and excluding others, to manipulate, and we see a lot of that, and I see a lot of that in my practice, particularly with people who are manipulative as part of their characteristic in terms of their substance abuse disorder. When you put money into the equation, they become very manipulative, to cause projection and blame and emotion, to control, to foster unnatural dependencies, to assuage paternal guilt. And again, I see a lot of that, particularly with adolescent and young adult patients who have really failed to launch, where you have parents who were not really available for their children emotionally because of workaholism and because they were out making the money. They basically substitute money for emotion. To substitute for a heartfelt apology and to express boundary problems. And again, I see in my practice where you have people who throw money around recklessly. They tend to have very poor boundaries, and people who are very miserly with money tend to also be very miserly with their emotions. So it's important to look at how money flows in a person's life interpersonally and interpersonally. So how they look at money themselves and how it functions in their relationship. So again, repeating myself, money is an energetic. It's I use the comparison to electricity. I mean, we know that we have to admit that, listen, money serves a very important function in our world, and it has incredible potential to do great good. It also has potential to do destruction, and so we need to take a look at that. And the analogy I use is to electricity. And so, we all have lights on and we all have our computers running, but if we were to stick our finger in the socket, it would be a bit of a different story. And again, we know that money's energetic is often improperly used in a psychotherapeutic relationship, and that is really what we want to talk about here. What happens when you put wealth, power, and status into the psychotherapeutic relationship? So at its core, what we're talking about is really developing a new cultural competency. So we know that people of wealth present as a minority, right? I mean, we all can just turn on the news and open up a newspaper or turn on the computer and see, particularly in light of the whole Occupation Wall Street movement, which I'll talk about in detail a little later, that we are the 99%, you are the 1%. And so there's this very clear otherness that happens there, and we know that people of wealth exist as a minority. And as part of that minority, they display many of the identification difficulties, such as suspiciousness of outsiders, loneliness, and isolation that are generally characteristic of any other minority group. So again, getting back to this issue of cultural competency, which is really at the core of what we're doing here, it requires us to expand the definition of cultural competency, and it really it makes us stand on our head and look at cultural competency in a different way. Because when we typically think of cultural competency, right? I mean, I went to Antioch. I did my master's degree at Antioch in Los Angeles, and from day one, we were very much taught that we need to be aware of, we develop cultural competency, and part of our capacity to learn to empathize with people different from ourselves is learning how to relate and understand the experience of people different from ourselves. Historically, though, it's fallen into certain categories. So, for instance, we can all agree people of color, women, for instance, feminist theory adds an enormous amount of value to our work. Sexual minorities, poor people, ethnic minorities. And what these groups, what these people have in common is their position of powerlessness in society. So in addition to being a minority that exists on the margins of society, they occupy a position of powerlessness. Well, when it comes to elite people, when it comes to people who are wealthy, who are powerful, and who have status, well, it's a bit of a different equation, isn't it? So as a helping profession, excuse me while I back up and go forward, as a helping profession, we're very accustomed to that, right? I mean, we're the authority, we're the trained professional who's reaching out a hand to help somebody who's in a position of helplessness and needs our help. When it comes to elite people, however, sort of notions of powerlessness, well, not really, right? I mean, if we look at this woman, lovely as she is, we're going to get some definite feelings. She's going to invoke very clear feelings from us. Powerlessness is not one of them, right? I mean, we can say narcissistic, we can say self-absorbed, we can fall into all the stereotypes and prejudices we have towards elite people. And then, of course, you know, they say things that don't engender an enormous amount of compassion to them. I'm not sure how many of you know who this person is. This is Gina Reinhardt, who happens to be the world's wealthiest woman. And she made the news a couple months ago for this quote where she said, "If you're jealous of those with more money, just don't sit there and complain. Do something to make more money yourself. Spend less time drinking or smoking and socializing and more time working." Now, you can imagine that this did not engender an enormous amount of compassion for her, and it just further added to the stigma and the prejudices that we had towards elite people, that they're out of touch, that they're self-absorbed, that they're heartless. So again, we exist in that world. And what happens, what we forget in that equation is that we forget that all of our clients are human. And this isn't a quantitative analysis. We can't say, oh, clients who have a net worth of under, I don't know, $100,000 are human, but if you have a net worth of $1 million, well then somehow it's okay to dehumanize you, and I think that's very much the world that we live in, that we somehow have attached a quantitative notion to the qualitative experience of people and of our patients, and quite frankly, it's common and it's normal because we are human, right? We bring our humanness to the work. At least I hope we do, and so we forget that. And I've been talking about this for a while now, and I travel around the world talking about this. And people will raise their hand and they'll say, "Well, Dr. Hokemeyer, how do I not make this happen? How do I not have these negative reactions to this work?" And that's not really the answer. We're not asking ourselves to amputate these feelings from us. I mean, it's similar, right, to our patients that come to us and say, "Dr. Hokemeyer, how do I not be depressed?" It's more of an analysis of looking at the reasons and the causality behind it, and looking at these really deeply ingrained beliefs that we live with that occur to us on a conscious and an unconscious level. And again, I'll talk about that in a few slides from now. And so, well, actually not a few slides, in this slide right here. So we know that human behavior, right, is a product of an endless stream of perceptions, feelings, and thoughts that happen at both the conscious and the unconscious levels. And I think, again, that we need to be very aware of this, that consciously we're starting, and by you guys participating in this workshop and paying attention and engaging in this dialogue, consciously we're having an awareness of these issues. Unconsciously, though, we're still going to have a reaction to it, and so we need to be aware of those reactions and have a process by which we can manage it in a way that it doesn't have a negative impact on the alliance that we're trying to establish by our patients. So where do these attitudes and behaviors come from in us? Well, basically from our early childhood, right? It all happens at home. It all begins at home. And so, for instance, my early childhood, I grew up in a family that was profoundly influenced by money, and upper middle class family that thought that money was basically the panacea, that which healed all wounds, that which solved all problems. That was the neighborhood that I lived in, and that's the second point here, interaction with families, friends, teachers, and neighbors. We know that wealth is a very relative construct, and so basically you could be living in a lovely neighborhood and driving a Chevy, and your neighbor pulls up in a Mercedes-Benz, and all of a sudden now you're going to have a reaction. This may invoke feelings of envy and resentment and feelings of inferiority to you. Meanwhile, 2 seconds before you saw him in the Mercedes, you were quite proud of your accomplishments and what you had done with your life. Cultural and religious traditions play into this. And the last bullet point is the one that I'm particularly interested in and fascinated with, and that's modern technology and the messages in the mass media. And I think the world that we live in we're so bombarded with information, and we live in such a wired, connected, hyper-connected world. I think we're constantly bombarded with these messages, and we only need to look at the success of a lot of popular television, for instance, the Real Housewives franchise, which has been hugely, hugely successful. We can all make fun of it, and I do from time to time. But I think, we need to be paying attention to the success of that show and what it's telling our children and our daughters in particular about what it means to be a woman of wealth and what that means. And so again, we're consuming all of this stuff, and it's going into our psyche and our conscious and our unconscious mind, and it gets to us on a cellular level, so we have a cellular reaction to it. And again, I want to just stress again that we as psychotherapists, as evolved and as trained and as processed as we are, the research consistently shows that our countertransference towards people of wealth can very much damage or undermine the psychotherapeutic relationship. And this is what we want to avoid, because we want to be providing the most clinically and culturally competent care that we can. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the research in the field, because a lot of the good research happened in the 70s, and it really grew out of New York and the psychoanalytic community. And basically these were clinicians who were giving their clinical impressions, and there wasn't really any good empirical research being done, primarily because access to population. It's a very hidden population, and for the reasons that we'll talk about, it's very isolated and guarded, and rich people are not very willing to have an anonymous researcher come in and poke around and say, tell me about your life, tell me about your psyche. And so it's been a very hidden population. The work picked up again in the 90s. Again, this is all psychoanalytically based. I don't have her cited in here, but we're going to talk about Joni Brafman's work. She came out with her work in 1987, and she developed the construct of wealthism, which we'll be spending some time talking about. She's really the first researcher who systematically did a study of people of wealth and did a qualitative study of the lived experience of what that was like. She had access because she was a Brafman, and so she had a network of high net worth people who she could access. My research then picked it up in 2011, and hopefully I encourage all of you listening out there and to really, start doing some research in this space, because anybody who's thinking about doing a PhD or in the PhD program and looking for a dissertation topic, I highly encourage it, because there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in this field. So again, we do this work, we look at these issues, and we have these conversations because we want to provide clinically and culturally competent care to our patients and avoid pitfalls in the psychotherapeutic relationship. And particularly, we want to make sure that we're aware of what's happening in the transference and the countertransference. And I think we're all aware of what that is, right? Transference is basically the conscious and unconscious reactions that the patient has towards us. And then the countertransference is the conscious and the unconscious reaction that I'm going to have to my patient. So if I'm dealing with an adolescent boy, he's going to project on me paternal paternal qualities, and I in turn am going to have somewhat of a protective paternal response to him. And so we need to be aware of that, and we need to be working in that, because that's the father, I think, where we can really create a new experience for our patients and form a reparative experience for them. So the first thing, again, that we want to do is not transference, countertransference, but awareness. We definitely need to cultivate an awareness around something that I call our financial frame of reference. And so these are the things that produce the habitual thinking and behavior that are going to profoundly impact how we operate in the world around issues of money. And we all have them. And so to prove that point, let's basically talk about what is your financial frame of reference. And when I do this in a group of people, I always have people call them out. So when I put this equation out for you, money equals blank, I want you to just sort of not think about this deeply. Just go from top brain and just kind of tell me what comes to mind. The word that's on the tip of your tongue when I put this out here, money equals blank. And so basically what happens when we do this in a room of people, we get a whole host of things. It basically breaks down to four things that I'm going to talk about. But, you know, I get things from money equals power, which is the most prominent one, to money equals enslavement, or money equals powerlessness, or money equals love, money equals manipulation. So we have a wide range of reactions that people have, but it's important to just get those out on the table so we know where we're operating from. So empirically, we know that it breaks down into four things. Money equals power. For most people, that's in the top part of their brain, that there's this sense of power that comes from having money, and essentially there's a good solid reason for that, and that is because money can buy goods, services, and loyalty. It's used to acquire importance, domination, and control, straight out. From a psychoanalytic standpoint, I always think it's fun to throw that in, and important, that it's seen as a search to regress to infantile fantasies of omnipotence, so that again there's this element of power that the infant is craving and that we all basically crave, and that money tends to symbolize power for us. In terms of our patient population, we know that the money equals power people fall into three categories. The first is the manipulator, and they use money to exploit others' vanities and greed. By manipulating other people, they feel less helpless and frustrated in the world. The greatest loss is to their own personal integrity. The second one is the empire building, and they have an overriding sense of independence and self-reliance. They deny their own dependency needs and make others dependent upon them. Again, the thing that's in common here is the fear of intimacy that these people share. The third one is the godfather who use money to bribe or control and feel to dominate. They often hide an anger and hypersensitivity to feeling humiliated. So again, at some point in their life, very early on, there was an ego breach, a breach to their narcissistic ego that made them fear intimacy and vow never to be vulnerable again. And they use money in a way to empower themselves. The other one, the other second most common reaction that people have to the equation is the money equals freedom. And again, we know that there is an element to this, right? That the underlying theme here is that dependency on other people and on the world early in life was threatening rather than a rewarding experience. So again, at some point in their lives, they had a breach to their ego, which resulted in them vowing to swearing off intimacy. There are two types of freedom worshipers that we see. The first one is the freedom fighters. These are typically our trust fund kids who reject money and materialism as the cause of the enslavement of many, and they use the passive aggressive techniques to resolve internal and interpersonal conflicts. Typically how I see this manifested in my practice is when I'll have a teen or an adolescent, or adolescent has become more and more delayed and we see adolescence extending itself into its 30s and many times, in my practice, and we have these trust fund people who are still manipulating their parents for money and continuing to cause crises in their lives around money. And again, it's very much underlying that is because they have parents who were emotionally unavailable for them and again felt that money solved all problems. And again, the child is using the crisis to manipulate the money, manipulate the parents to respond to them. What they really want is an emotional response, but what historically has been given to them is a financial response. And so then that's a good insight that we as clinicians can have to break that cycle and to give them a reparative experience or the insight that they need to begin to have the reparative experience in their own relationship. The second is basically the people who are self-made. And again, I'm sure I'm going to get a question along the way. Dr. Hokemeyer, isn't there a big difference in the psyche of self-made people versus inherited wealth? And that's absolutely, it's profound. It's quite different. People who are self-made tend to have addictive personalities, be narcissistic, and want immediate gratification. And people who are self-made tend to really have low sense of self, low self-concept, and really a fear that they can't survive in the world on their own resources. So it's a profoundly different personality construct. But for purposes of this presentation, we're giving an overview of it, and you can talk in details about it a little bit later, how that manifests itself. So these guys and gals are the people who use money to escape from orders that restrict their autonomy and limit their independence. They want independence, not love. This is the patient that comes to me to go to treatment who basically says, well, Dr. Hokemeyer, I'm paying X, Y, and Z to go to treatment. If I don't want to go to morning and group in the morning, do I have to go? Do I have to go? The answer, of course, is yes. So that's where that falls into. The third one here is money equals security. And we know that emotional security is represented by financial security, and this is a linear process, right? The more money I have, the more security I think I will have. Money is an emotional life jacket, a method of staving off anxiety, and we know from a lot of people who are workaholics and who are compulsive earners, it's not really about spending the money. They're basically more concerned about earning the money, and they tend to be hoarder and miserly in their spending habits. But again, it's all about quantifying their success in the world and accumulating as much money as they possibly can. They turn to money for security. It can alienate people, right, because they're not available emotionally. And the fear of financial loss becomes paramount because the security collector depends more and more on money for ego satisfaction. So again, there's really never enough here because they don't have the core ego strength to handle the slings and arrows, if you will, of life. The fourth one, and certainly by no means the last, there are certainly other ones, but the foremost common is money equals love. And we certainly know that we love money, right? Money means different things to men than it does to women. Typically, for women, it's typically security and comfort, and for men, it is about power and identity and prestige. Just clicking through some of these images here. Again, money is often given as a substitute for emotion and affection. It's used to buy affection, loyalty, and self-worth. And again, we see that a lot with, particularly in the families that I work with, where we have highly successful parents and children who are desperate for love and attention and aren't getting it, but are getting lots of stuff instead. Again, we can break this down furthermore into three categories. So we have the love buyer who uses money to buy love and respect. These are typically our patients who visit prostitutes, give to charity, and spoil their children. I had a patient once who gave, I always get the number confused, but I think it was it was $15 million to a university in New York and would carry around a copy of the check and actually showed it to me. And, as if that was basically his validation that was his currency. That's how he provides value in the world, and very critically important piece of clinical information there as to how he defined himself and how he saw his value in the world. The love seller, which by the way tends to be us in the helping profession. I mean, we do charge for what we do, and that is often very much a point of conflict, I think, for us as clinicians in terms of our own integrity and in terms of the authenticity of our work. But the point remains that we do sell our time and we sell our compassion and empathy. And again, these are people who typically promise affection, devotion, and endearment for inflating others' ego. Hopefully this is not the extent of our work, but basically these are the people who fall into this category on the more severe scale, the more severe side of this. They're good at feigning emotions and attracted to love buyers, and again, they gravitate towards the caring professions. And then again, the love stealer, hungry for love but don't feel they deserve it. They need to take the risk out of loving but have superficial relationships. So again, they're similar to the love buyer here. So they're using money again to solidify the relationship. And so I talked a bit before, and I'll talk now again about our own resistance to talking about money with our patients and how that can really cause instability in the dyad, in the therapeutic dyad we have with our patients. And I make it a matter of policy, both in my private practice and in the clinical team that I supervise, in terms of I have no interest in knowing the quantitative value of my patient. I have no interest in knowing how much they're worth. I am interested in knowing qualitatively what's happening in their lives. And so if we're really looking to see how money is playing out in a person's family and in their own psyche, a tool that I've developed really, and it's just an extension of a typical genogram that we use quite effectively in the field, and we have for a number of years, where we trace pathology, where we trace mental illness, where we trace addiction in a family. I think it's helpful to stabilize any insecurity that we may have in working with our patients by bringing it into the therapeutic dyad and using it as a tool to triangulate any instability and talk about how money has flows, how money was made, how money was created in a family. And so you can see, for instance, I'll use myself as an example here. Paternally, I had a grandfather Jewish German who came over from Germany, imagine that, and made a lot of money, lost a lot of money, made a lot of money, lost a lot of money as a result of his alcoholism. My father inherited an enormous amount of financial insecurity and anxiety around money, which he lovingly passed on to his children, including me. And so by opening that dialogue up in a way with our patients, we can begin to see how money has caused some emotional pathology and issues in our family of origin. So I would encourage you, if you have some reluctance, or even if you don't have reluctance, this is a good tool to utilize in your practice in talking about your patients. And what we tend to find is that, again, we have a very complicated and conflicted view of wealth here. And so just to talk on this a little bit more, I had this come alive for me in a very significant way. I live in Manhattan and work in Manhattan, and I live in downtown Manhattan, and I work in midtown Manhattan. And when the Occupy Wall Street movement was going on, I was, of course, drawn to it like a moth to the flame, and I would go down there and wander around and try to drink it all in, and it was a very conflicted and schizophrenic experience. On the one hand, it was a very peaceful occupation, but yet it was surrounded by all of this hostility where it was very heavily guarded, very heavily armed, sidewalks were sealed off. There was this real sense of danger and a real threat there, and in the occupation, the message was basically that there's an enormous amount of inequity in wealth distribution, and again, there was this very much of a didactic between the 1% who was othered and the 99% who was we. And then in that experience, I would go up to my office in Midtown and get off on the subway by the Apple store on Fifth Avenue, and Steve Jobs had just died. And so I'd go by the Apple store where people were making shrines to Steve Jobs, who, created one of the world's most valuable corporations. And so again, we have this very complicated and conflicted view of wealth. And in a subway ride, I saw this demonization and then this idolization of wealth. Now, we know that if we look down a little bit deeper, we know that there are some more subtle nuances to them, that, again, the demonization occurs where people are making huge amounts of money in ways that we don't understand. For instance, hedge funds. Nobody really knows what a hedge fund is or how it works, and we know that people are making huge amounts of money out of that. On the other hand, Steve Jobs created something very valuable that adds enormous value into our lives. So again, we know that there are nuances to this, but again, there's this incredibly conflicted and complicated view of wealth. So getting back to why we are spending our lunch break talking about all of this, how do these issues impact our relationships with our patients? Well, in very, very significant ways. The first way that they impact them is that there tends to be an objectification of people of wealth, right? We know that wealthy people are often seen by their treatment professionals as symbols or objects of their wealth rather than the human beings they are. And this objectification occurs, again, because we're human, and because we're taught basically that wealthy people are objects, that they're these stereotypes, and and this happens a lot in terms of clinicians setting their fees. And most of us work on a sliding scale, but there have been instances that have been reported to me by patients where they felt that they were being gouged because they disclosed their identity as a person of wealth, and that all of a sudden they learned from a collateral source that the clinician's typical sliding scale was, say, 150 to 250, and yet when they came into treatment, being a well-known person, the fee was all of a sudden $450. So there's that which can occur, and it's easy to rationalize it away, right? A clinician can say, well, they can afford it, or they could rationalize by saying, well, by that person paying this higher fee, it enables me to see a lot of people on the lower side of the scale. Regardless of what the rationalization is, it's an objectification, and we need to be paying attention to that. The other thing that happens, quite frankly, is resentment and envy. And so I'll use an example of my own practice. So it's March. It's gray. It's cold. It's been gray. It's been cold. I am schlepping to my office on the subway, in the slush, in the dirt, in the grime, in the noise that's New York. It's 6 o'clock at night. I'm tired. I've had a full day. I just want to go home, take my clothes off, get something to eat. In comes my last patient, who is fresh from a month in St. Bart's, tan and tone, throws her $25,000 Hermes Birkin bag on the floor and starts complaining about how she hates St. Bart's. She'll never go there again because she can't get her private jet in there. Well, I have to be honest with you, I'm going to have a reaction. I'm going to have a bit of resentment, and I'm going to have a bit of envy, because here I've been in New York the whole time, and here you are complaining about this, her luxury problems. It's a reaction that I'm going to have regardless of how aware I am around this. The issue becomes, what do I do with that reaction? And how do I allow it to say to her, well, shouldn't you be grateful for the quality of your life? That is not the proper, in my opinion, is not the proper psychotherapeutic intervention here. What I need to do is calibrate my experience and work to calibrate it in a way that I can connect with her intersubjectively. You know what I'm talking about. I can't pronounce it, but I know what I'm talking about. Intersubjectively, thank you. So that I can basically calibrate my experience for her, and then I can focus on the issues that arose from her, which is basically, again, a bruise to her narcissistic ego and her need for immediate gratification and her lack of frustration tolerance. So again, getting out of my own way and my own resentment and envy, and focusing on the issues, the clinical issues that are relevant to her and that I want to be able to give her some insight on. Again, we know from the research, and again, Joni Brafman, who developed the construct of wealthism, part of the construct of wealthism is this element of resentment. And so wealthism is essentially the hostility and resentment that society in large feels towards people of wealth. And I'll say that again. Wealthism is the hostility and resentment that society at large holds towards people of wealth. Internalized wealthism is the construct that I've extended it further, and that's when people of wealth begin to internalize that hostility and resentment. It's not terribly different from internalized homophobia, which is really the construct that it was built upon, so that people of wealth begin to feel guilty about their wealth. They begin to have shame about their wealth. And so they internalize this resentment and anger that they feel in the world around them. earlier researchers maintain that we as clinicians are not exempt from the suspicion and dislike of the rich, and that again, that our wealthy patients can often arise in us strong feelings of hostility and resentment. Again, really the foundation of Joni's work, Joni Brofman and Wealthism, is hostility. And again, we've come far. We've come further than where she basically, I mean, her work basically said ipso facto, if you're rich, people hate you. The work was important, again, for a number of reasons, because she got that construct out on the table and we began working with it. We know that it's more nuanced than that. So for instance, people like Steve Jobs, we tend to idolize. Hedge fund managers, we tend to demonize. Other people, Steven Spielberg, who entertains us in a very profound way, we tend to idolize. Oprah Winfrey, we can idolize because, again, they create real value and meaning in our lives. But again, these people who are doing these derivatives or hedge funds, and who are getting exorbitant salaries for not producing anything of real tangible value, we do have a much more hostile reaction towards. Again, how it also plays out in terms of the transference is that wealthy patients are used to having their way. And so again, I talked about the characteristics, again, the addictive qualities, the compulsivity, and the narcissism, which can play out in terms of treating us as servants, that basically they see us as hired guns to accomplish an objective. And again, patients from a lower socioeconomic class look at us with more awe. They tend to hold us in higher regard than patients who are wealthy, and they can treat us, they can look at us as servants. So it's very important for us to be able to not have a negative reaction to have that in terms of how we respond, how our countertransference. We need to have a process by which we identify that and respond to it in a reparative, helpful way. The other thing is that these two other things basically is that this population tends to be highly critical. I've had several patients comment on my office. I now actually have a lovely office. Thank you, Caron, treatment centers. But prior to that, starting out in my career, I had a small office without windows, and one particular patient, and in particular, when I would challenge her on issues in terms of her relationship with her husband, she would snip, Dr. Hokemeyer, why don't you have any windows in your office? As a way of putting me in my place, in the exact same way that she would put her husband in his place when he would challenge her. And so, again, it's recognizing where this is coming from and getting to the clinical issues. Again, it's a very rejecting population. And again, these present very unique, and I'm looking at my time here, and I'm running very, very close. So these present very unique challenges to the psychotherapeutic relationship, and particularly to the attachment bond that we have with our patients. And I want to speed it up a little bit here so we can get into the solution, because I know we're all solution focused, and you didn't get on this call to hear about the problem. So basically, what we need to do with these patients is to provide them with a secure and empathetic frame. So, Dr. Hokemeyer, what does that mean? Well, essentially what it means is we need to develop the capacity to empathize and get into the head of a wealthy person. What exactly does that mean? And that's where my research came in. So if you're a person of wealth, how safe is the world? Well, if we kind of look around us, right? Doesn't look terribly safe. I mean, there's a lot of this stuff out there. There's a lot of this hostile imagery. And again, it's very acceptable to demonize people of wealth, as if we have this quantitative barrier on who we can demonize and who we can't. And as a result of this, wealthy people become very guarded. And again, this hostility that they perceive and these negative stereotypes lead people of wealth to avoid talking about their wealth with people outside their socioeconomic class. This is particularly relevant, I think, when we talk about economically segregated treatment programs and psychotherapeutic groups. And I'll give an example of that later. Isolated, people also become quite isolated. That the isolation results from the hostility, envy, resentment, and greed they feel from others. So what happens when we have the wealth and we have the substance abuse? Well, we have the construct that I refer to as the double closet. And so basically the premise here is that while economically diverse treatment programs may provide a base level of competency in providing elite patients insight into their closet of substance abuse disorders, they fail to assist them in fully transcending the double closet that prevents them from authentically connecting with human beings. Now that is a whole lot here. But essentially we know that the first closet consists of the shame and stigma of addiction. The second consists of the interpersonal fortress of their socioeconomic status. And I always want to take a moment here to pay homage to a hero, I think, who we're all standing on the shoulders of, and that's Betty Ford. I mean, a woman of power, of status, of prestige, who came out and said, I have a substance abuse disorder. Her coming out in that way was really quite profound. So to meet this challenge, we must enable our patients to feel safe. And I want to highlight that feel safe because our patients are incredibly intuitive. And it's not enough to tell them, trust me. I mean, I think in many regards, that's the worst thing we can do to our patients is to say, trust them. They're going to test us. They're going to make sure that we are worthy of their trust. And part of this work that you're doing here today is becoming worthy of their trust by becoming aware of these hot buttons and these issues. They must intuitively feel they are understood and heard, valued for the emotionally vulnerable human beings who they are, not manipulated, objectified, idealized, or demonized as a result of their elite status. As a result, they must become vulnerable with their full identities and trust the people and communities in whom they've entrusted their cares. And I'll give an example here of from the work at Ocean Drive. We, at one point in treatment, we had a preponderance of lesbians who had private planes. I had no idea how we got that demographics, but we had it. And so during treatment, one of the patient's girlfriends, now wife, took the plane and flew a number of her friends to New York and saw shows and spent a lot of money and dinners and what have you. The patient felt very betrayed, felt very manipulated, really questioned the integrity of her relationship, and was able to bring that in a group, and in a way where the group was able to not get caught up on the fact, oh my God, you have a private plane? Because that's what happens in more socially and economically diverse groups. People can't get past the fact that you have a plane and become attached to that and want to know what it's like to have a private plane. Well, that's not the clinical issue here. The clinical issue is, what does that feel like for you to have somebody who you love and trust act in a way that makes you question their trustworthiness and the reasons why they're in the relationship for you? So again, this is the reason why I think that it's very important that we provide our patients with this frame that is culturally competent. And so psychotherapeutically, it's one that recognizes both the humanness of the clinician and the patient, and it provides them a process to identify issue with money, power, and celebrity, and it responds creatively to the responses that we have. Again, psychosocially, it's one that can provide the patient with a safe and secure community. It moves the patients towards a reparative experience and provides the patients with a similar level of comfort to that to which they are accomplished. Now listen, the patients that we see in treatment at Ocean Drive, we would never be able to recreate the level of luxury that they have in their life. What we do provide them, though, is with an environment that's egosyntonic, that enables them, that's consistent with their self-image, and that really enables them to be present for treatment and be able to become really clear and full with their full identities. So that is, I think I have a little note here, 3 minutes until question and answers, although basically I'm done. This is basically who we are, the continuum of care at Caron. I'm affiliated with Caron, main Caron, and with the senior clinical advisor of the Ocean Drive program, which is based in Boca Raton, Florida. We have facilities in Texas, the Hanley Center, and Renaissance in Boca Raton, Florida. So hopefully we are on track here, and we can go to some questions.
Paul, thank you very much. Very informative presentation. We do have some questions that have come in from the audience. We want to remind our participants today that they can still use the Q&A area to the right of the slides to submit a question at any time. And if you cannot see that area, you may click the red Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So we'll try to get through some questions in the remaining minutes of our session today. One thing I'm interested in, Paul, is In terms of a treatment center setting, where you may have individuals of some means, how do you see that they interact with other either individuals in similar financial circumstances, or maybe in other financial circumstances if it happens to be a program where maybe there is a little bit of difference there, and there may be someone who is perceived by the rest of the group to be of much larger means if that happens? I'm just curious as to what you think some of the dynamics are in a sort of a treatment center setting.
Sure. Yeah. What I found in my experience in more socially economically diverse programs, with which Caron is, that people tend to really be, they're much more forward with their substance abuse disorder and talking about that, but they tend to stay very reserved about their their identity as a person of wealth. So they still remain very guarded, and they never really get to those issues. They may find somebody else in the program who has a similar background, and then they form a bond where they can address, talk about those issues with the other person. But again, it's becoming part of the whole community. There's a real reluctance and a resistance to do that in a very full and complete way.
I see. Interesting. We have a question that came in from a participant here. The question is, how do we manage negative feelings toward clients who are treating us like servants?
Well, sometimes, it's important to pay attention to it, and then it's important to call them out. I think one of the things that we tend to do as clinicians when there is a power struggle like that, we tend to, defer. If somebody comes in my office and they're profoundly successful financially, there's a real power differential there, and so I can tend to idolize that person, and I'm going to be more reluctant to call them out. But I think it's important to call them out. And so, for instance, with this patient who I had was challenging me about my windowless office, I just asked her directly, what does that mean? Does that make you feel that I'm an inferior therapist? And to have her really become aware of what she was doing and work, again, intersubjectively in terms of calibrating my experience with her experience and being able to talk about that and telling her, basically this is how that makes me feel, and having a conversation about it, and then talking in terms of, is this a new experience? Is this something that you haven't experienced of before? And interestingly, in this particular case, it was a way that she reacted to her husband. She came from a very prominent family in Asia. Her husband was Chinese and came from a basically working-class Chinese family, but it did very well for himself on Wall Street. But she was always holding, her breeding over him and castrating him in many regards. And so it was important for her to see that dynamic and to see how it plays out.
Very good. Question from a program that works with younger adults. It says, we work with 20 to 30-year-olds who have grown up in wealthy families. Do you have any recommendations of how to address situations when our clients may feel that they've been forced into treatment by their wealthy parents, i.e., if you don't do this, there's no more money coming your way?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that you need to have a conversation about. And I, again, would start by using the financial genogram and work with the patient and to say, let's look at the role money has played in your family of origin, and look at it, and then really probably where you want to get it to, the place you want to get to is money equals emotions in that family. And then if you can get to that place, then you can have a more qualitative conversation with the patient as to what the money represents and take it out of this quantitative range. And then hopefully it's a program that has a family therapy component, then you can just put the cards on the table and just have a conversation about it. And, again, we as therapists are very reluctant to talk about money, and so put it on the table. Say, this is the issue that we're working with, and it's causing some backlash, and it's causing a lot of resistance to the patient's treatment.
This is a question that is sort of talking about the demographic of the addiction treatment field a little bit. The person asks, are there treatment centers exclusive to the wealthy, and if not, should there be? I guess you can talk a little bit about what you see as the landscape out there and whether you think those programs are useful.
It's interesting. One of the reasons why I became so fascinated in this work and why I'm passionate about it is because I think over the last 20 years we've seen an explosion of what we call luxury treatment facilities, and the focus was on amenities. And so it's a great piece of land. They have a private chef and they have great sheets. Nobody really has paid attention to the unique clinical needs of this population. And so I think, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so grateful for Caron for giving me this opportunity to have really a fellowship and to take a look at the unique clinical issues that we're talking about today. And so I don't feel it's of real value if all they're basically going to do is get a great geographic location and good sheets. If they have a clinical and cultural competency where they are trained and can work specifically with these patients and with the issues that arise, then I definitely feel that it's worthwhile. And again, what I want to point out here is that we're talking psychotherapy here, and we're not talking about AA, which is a whole completely different conversation. But basically, what we want to do is we want to provide our patients with a safe, secure place that they can get to their core issues, and that we can give them insight and then give them tools that they can use to be more successful in the world. And so, again, the answer to the question is, I don't feel that basically if you're going to an economically segregated program that isn't paying attention to these unique clinical and cultural issues, don't do it. If there is one that is paying attention to it, then by all means. But again, this isn't for everybody. I mean, I wouldn't send an entitled trust funder to Ocean Drive, no matter how much the kid's worth, because again, they need to learn. It's not really about rehabilitation, it's about habilitation, and the person needs to deal with their entitlement. They need to deal with their grandiosity, and putting them in a program that is economically segregated, I don't feel it's appropriate. So again, it's very much on a case-by-case basis, and just because a person's rich doesn't mean that they're appropriate for an economically segregated program. It needs to happen on a very much of a case-by-case basis.
Excellent. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Interesting question that came in. Have you noticed any association between addiction and other mental health diagnoses among the wealthy?
Well, again, we see that, again, no surprise, there's an addictive personality. And so the issues that I really see come up clinically, and this isn't a diagnosis answer, the two issues that basically the patients struggle with are relationship issues and existential issues. So the relationships in their lives are for crap, and they're struggling to find meaning in their world because they have the brass ring and they're in an enormous amount of emotional pain. So those are the two issues basically that the patients are struggling with. Diagnostically, we see a fair amount of bipolar. We see a fair amount of depression. We see a fair amount of anxiety disorders. We see a lot on the Access 2 scale. We see a lot of narcissistic personality disorder. We see a lot of dependent personality disorder. We see a lot of avoidant personality disorder. So again, Access 1, it's really depression, anxiety, bipolar. Access 2, kind of the whole host of personality clusters that come in with personality disorders. So again, there's this enormous amount of comorbidity that comes in. And again, because people of wealth, particularly people of wealth who made their own money, tend to have an addictive personalities, we're not seeing really just a substance abuse disorder in and of itself. Huge amounts of prescription drug abuse, huge amount of sexual compulsivity, internet stuff, a lot of process addictions, a lot of disordered eating among the women, a fair amount of disordered eating among the men. So again, in addition to the main presenting issue, which is the substance abuse disorders, we're seeing huge amounts. I would say probably 98% with another underlying addiction that needs to be addressed.
Well, Paul, thank you very much. I think that's going to be our last question. And at this time, I'll pass along some final instructions regarding CE credit. At this time, please click on the green CE certificate button located at the bottom of your screen to generate your CE certificate for this event. Please save the certificate to your hard drive first before printing. Please also note that you must have viewed today's entire program to qualify for a CE certificate. Should you have any other questions or issues regarding CE certificates, please click the Contact CE Help Desk button at the bottom of your screen to email our help desk. You can also reach this desk at webinars@vendomegrp.com. As a registrant of today's event, you will receive an email in the next 24 hours which will provide on-demand access to an archived recording of this presentation for up to 1 year from today's date to share with colleagues. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, we invite you to view a list of our upcoming webinars and to join our community discussion through our Facebook and LinkedIn groups through the links featured in today's resource list. I want to thank Paul Hokemeyer once again for an excellent presentation today. I also would like to thank our sponsor, Caron Treatment Centers, for making today's program possible. Finally, thank you to you and our audience for participating today. We hope you'll join us in the future for another Addiction Professional Behavioral Healthcare webinar. This concludes today's presentation.